All right, everyone. So this is Jason Van Gumster. He is a professional animator, kind of focusing more on 3D. Is that kind of fair to say? Or
Yeah, for the
okay.
most part.
And so what would my students maybe know? Would my students know any of your works or any of your previous work? Where would they have seen it if they had seen it?
So probably not likely. I tend to do live a little bit more on the esoteric side of where 3D gets used and use it in a lot of weird ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see it. Things
Mhm.
like uh, I've used it for banknote design.
Okay.
For that, I've used it for industrial visualization. I've used it for for a good spat there. I did local TV commercials,
Okay.
and those sort of things. But yeah, as far as large scale stuff that your students may have seen, it's unlikely because
Okay.
3D gets used all sorts of weird ways.
Sure, sure. Um, so since this is more of like an animation course, where does your love of, or where does your beginning of animation start off?
With the movement, I mean, flip books, right?
But
That's
books.
that's that's where they started for me as a kid. I would make little flip books of whatever things transforming into other things, characters walking around,
Mhm.
sometimes just weird things, little sometimes little dumb jokes, that sort of stuff. But
Sure.
whatever I could convey movement to and sort of bring life to in what a stack of index cards that thick,
Right.
and rock it from there. And then yeah, I mean, animation, I actually got into animation on, so what my background is both in engineering and in animation.
Okay.
And I specifically got into animation because it is, in my opinion, one of the only art forms where you can do any other art form. And I'm kind of greedy about wanting to do everything. And
Okay.
so, with animation, you can do sculpture, you can do 3D animation, you can do drawn animation, and you can do painting,
Right.
the like oil on glass stuff. It's fun. So if the ability to work on in any medium whatsoever and then convey movement to it, animation is one of the few areas where you can actually do that.
Sure. No, for sure. So you're doing flip books. Do you go to, sounds like, did you go to college for engineering or animation or both? Or
I went to Virginia Commonwealth University for both animation. They called the department was kinetic imagery, which is animation, video, sound design. And
okay.
I also went to the engineering school because there's not very much overlap. You couldn't really
Right,
do
right.
like a dual major. I actually ended up having to get two
Well, I went to
degrees.
Carnegie Mellon, so I understand that. Like,
Yeah.
it's
So,
definitely there was the art department and the CS, even though there's a lot of integration between the two, but they were definitely
yeah.
very separate.
So the engineering was in computer engineering. So,
Okay.
but yeah, I went and did both of them. I don't necessarily recommend it, but I had a
Right.
lot of fun.
Okay. So you go, you learn 3D animation. When do you start making your when where does that take your work that you do, your animation work?
So the animation work actually, I would say that the start of all of that actually happened on the video side of things. I was
Okay.
working local television studios, actually did a lot of TV spots, a lot of commercials and promos and those sort of things. And what it comes down to is when you do animation, the process of like doing video editing, outside of understanding video technology and
Mhm.
those sort of things, editing is animation light. So I
Right.
was
I agree.
I was working at a small studio that was doing they exclusively did car dealer spots, and I was
Right.
cranking 30-second spots. I was
Yeah.
cranking out between 30 and 40 of those a month.
Wow.
So I can edit in my sleep now, which is great.
Yeah.
Uh, so I was doing that while I was still in school, and
Mm.
then when I graduated, I actually worked a little bit more on the sort of slightly engineering and automation side of things because I also done some web development stuff while I was there, and
Mm.
then uh, about a year later, I started my own animation studio, which
Mm.
is basically it was a very like it was basically me that I could scale up for larger projects and I could pull in more freelancers to do it. So it's
Sure.
basically glorified freelancing, but I could put
Right,
studio
right.
in my name. Uh,
Yeah.
and so yeah, that's where I was doing a lot of continued doing TV spots.
Okay.
But because I had built my own pipeline, because I was using Blender in particular, I found myself using animation for a bunch of sort of unexpected uses outside of doing car spots or doing
Sure.
helping folks on their indie films or those sort of things. I
Right.
was also doing uh, little things like uh, I worked with Honda Research Institute,
Mm,
which is a research division of Honda, to develop a humanoid character with a Python API.
okay.
Because this is like in 2012, they were training neural networks for AI back then. So I'm
Okay.
responsible for the AI apocalypse. Uh,
Sure.
but yeah, they were basically trying to have their vehicle vision systems recognize pedestrians, and the
Right.
cost of photographing people in the field or even having models do it was really expensive. So I built a 3D model of a person with a Python API that they could just generate thousands of images to train their neural network on
Um,
recognizing pedestrians.
I
And
see.
so yeah,
Interesting.
so yeah, a combination of modeling, a little bit of programming, a
Mhm.
lot of automation. So fun things
Right.
there. Um,
Well, why don't you talk a little bit? So you kind of, I feel like are you a little more on the sort of scripting side of animation, where maybe you're kind of writing some code that does some animation,
I
or
I have a philosophy because I feel like I'm firmly in the creative side of it,
okay,
but if I find myself doing the same thing more than 3 times in a row, I'm
right,
also lazy, so therefore I
sure,
try to find a way to automate it.
okay.
But that takes you down a rabbit hole of writing scripts or building render farms or those sort of things, um, which I was fortunate enough to be able to try to figure out and do. But yeah, it's all of that is to facilitate making something cool or fun.
Um, so with your more recent work, I don't know, have you done any recent animation work, specific
So
animation and not
is it
like,
say
modeling per se only, or
so I would say that in the last 3 years, most of my work has actually been related to consulting. I've been
okay,
helping tool makers and studios integrate Blender into the
integrate
pipelines.
Blender.
Blender's being more and more popular. So, for example, Adobe
Sure,
they have great artists on staff.
sure, sure.
Even more 3D now that they bought Algorithmic and the whole Substance stack, but all of their art
What did Algorithmic have?
Substance.
Okay, that's like the one 3D pro. I don't know though.
Yeah.
Okay. Are
So
they
they
like
they
is
bought
that meant for more like industrial design
no, it's
or?
like Substance Painter is in Substance Designer. These are for doing texturing and
Oh,
material
okay, okay.
and those sort of things. And so they had purchased them, and then they had a Substance Modeler and a bunch of they started dipping in more
Mhm.
and more into the 3D space. And while they have really talented Maya artists on staff, 90% or more of their customers are using Blender. So in order to support their customers,
Right.
they needed to learn how to use Blender. So they pulled me in to give a series of workshops to their staff on how to use it.
Um, so when you were doing kind of less consulting and more animation, can you kind of, a lot of my students now they're coming from a 2D background, and
Mhm.
this might be in my next class where we have done some Blender and some very basic 3D modeling, and we may even be into the part where we've done rigging or some simple animation. But can you kind of walk us through what a project would look like for you? Because I think for
Sure.
my students, they're used to doing 2D, but it's kind of I mean, not that it's entirely different, but there's a little bit of a different process
There
between a
is.
2D project in Animate or Procreate or whatever versus, something in a Blender or Maya type environment with 3D. So can you kind of walk through your process a little bit? Just kind of give them
Sure,
more
sure. I
insight.
mean, for the most part, it's very much it's not that different from a 2D pipeline up to the point where you start working with 3D stuff. I
Sure.
mean, pre-production is the biggest, most important part of all of this. The actual script and storyboards, and
Right.
because the farther down the pipeline you go, the more expensive things get to be. And expensive
Right.
doesn't just mean money; it also means time,
Time.
right?
Yeah.
If you're all the way down to your final bit of your animation, and all of a sudden, oh, this needs to be 4 seconds longer, or the character is entirely, is blocked in the
Right. Right.
entirely wrong part of the scene.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is technically faster the second time you do it, but we try to avoid the second time doing it, right? um,
Measure twice, cut once. That's what
exactly,
most
exactly.
people say.
So yeah, it starts with the pre-production, all the planning, knowing exactly what's going to be and where, which on some level can take some of the zing out of it if you're trying to do something that's
Mhm.
purely creative, right? It's like you that level of spontaneity. You actually have to find that in the moment between your storyboard frames. That's where you get to have a little bit of the freedom and fun because
Mhm.
you're working on commercially, at least you're working on a deadline. So oftentimes, yeah, you do that pre-production, and whether it's for yourself or you're doing it for a client, that gets shown, that gets
Sure.
approved by somebody. Either you say, yeah, I like my drawing, I'm good, or you show it to a client and they get an idea of what they want, because when you do commercial work, the customer never knows what they want. They only know what they don't
Right.
want after you show it to them. So
Right.
show them something soon. uh, so
I used to do motion graphics. I just said, make it look like an Apple ad, and usually they're happy with that because that's really what
uh,
they want, but they won't say that.
right, right.
But anyway, sorry, you didn't mean to interrupt
No,
you.
no, no problem. And then once you have all that set, you have an understanding of what assets you need, right? I know what my environment basically looks like. It's going to be a farm, or it's going to be a city, or it's going to be whatever. I know what
Mhm.
characters are going to be involved. I know what
Right.
props are going to be involved. And whether you're doing that in 3D or 2D, now you have to build them. In 2D, right? You're designing them. You have to know what they look like in advance. Otherwise, you can't keep drawing them. Uh, or at least drawing them once and then doing cutout for whatever. You still have to have the character design. So that process, it's technically a part of the pre-production process, but it's still, what's going on with what's necessary. You sort of have a to-do list of things to create. And then
Mhm.
on the 3D side, those would be things where you actually have you start the modeling of that, and
Right.
rigging, and those sort of things. You also know what type of, how much you have to destroy the character, right? If you have a character that's got a lot of stretch, squash and stretch, and these sorts of things, your traditional sort of hard rigged character where it only bends in certain directions that are realistic,
Mm.
that's not going to fly for a really stylized look.
Right.
Likewise, if you're doing 2D animation, whether you're doing cutout or drawing every single frame, you need to know a little bit about what sort of distortions you can plan for, especially if it's going
Sure.
to be framed within the shot. So yeah, then yeah, you have all your assets built, your bits and pieces, and then yeah, from there it's assembly. Assuming that the storyboard. Usually, I don't show clients storyboards.
Oh,
Um,
really? Okay.
More, I show them animatics or
Oh,
or
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
or layout,
Yeah.
because while an animator can internalize an understanding of what the timing is going to be, most people who aren't animators won't,
Right.
and so you need to be able to convey that kind of timing, um, with very, at least somewhat loosely, and also communicate this is not final. This is not what the final look's going to look like, but
Yes.
you know. You kind of have to keep hammering that part in, is that it's still a work in
Don't
progress. It's
use
still going to be.
color because then they assume that if you make it green, that the final character is green, and you spend all your time explaining that no, I just used green because that's what I had, but it's not going to be green. It can be any color, but they don't.
Exactly. Um, and I mean that's also sort of the, I will also say that's one of the beauties of animation. Beauties, and also the double-edged sword of animation, is that you can do anything you want,
Right, right. We can make it anything. It's just this is a
but
placeholder.
you have to do everything you want.
Right, right.
Which is why it becomes also an inherently collaborative art form. It's very difficult to try and pull all of that off just by yourself, especially the longer format you get. 30-second spot you can usually pull off all on your own. You start going more than that, it can get a little bit crazier. Um, yeah, and then from there you're sort of off to the races of the actual animation process, and that's whether you're doing 2D or 3D. That's just I'll call it the slog of getting it done. It's
Sure.
the soggy middle of just getting the work done, and but it is the part where you can play a little bit between keys or sets or whatever to really put your own self into it and have some of that creative freedom between the frames.
So let's say you're doing a 30-second spot for a client or a personal project. How long, obviously it depends really on what you're doing, but like what's a realistic timeline?
That's always a hard one, because it depends on the level of complexity, right?
Right,
If it's 30 seconds of motion graphics, you can probably knock that out in a week. If it's 30 seconds of like two characters running around in a fight,
right,
okay, well,
right,
that's something slightly different that you have to sort of plan for and account for. So it does relate specifically to what it is, and a lot of that gets to be experiential. That's the other reason the storyboard exists, right?
right.
And the animatic exists, is that it's not just giving you a sense of timing and space. It's also giving you an understanding of the
Complexity.
complexity, and you're like, oh. well, I can cut a corner here. I can have this speaking part only on their eyes, so I don't have to do lip sync. And so you figure out where you can cut corners, especially if you're on a tight deadline. Because ultimately, what it comes down to is unless you're really, really good and people are working with you to work with you,
Mm,
you rarely ever get to decide the timeline.
right, right,
Client decides the timeline, and you fit what you can, what quality you can
right.
within
What you
that
can get
time,
within that amount of space.
and time, space, and I guess budget, right? Because it's going to be
Right,
the amount
sure.
of cost that's going to be imparted on that.
Um, when you so you've done both 2D and 3D, but it sounds like you kind of more focus on 3D. So what are some of the differences, or likes or dislikes, pros or cons between working in both that you found over the years?
So I think the biggest misconception anybody has is that one is faster than the other.
Hmm.
Uh, that is entirely false, right? You're displacing the amount of time you put in one thing or another. So you don't necessarily have as much asset creation time when you're doing 2D. You design the character, okay, you have it in the
Right,
round, go. Run. Whereas in 3D, I got the model, I got the texture, I got the UV unwrap, I got the rig, there's a lot of other things that you can throw
right.
in, and you can get corners on it, but that's where your time ends up being spent, and then you get to animate assuming that everything is in place to work with it. So um, I think there's a definite level of freedom you get with 2D that you don't
Mhm.
have by default with 3D. There are some things you can do with like Blender has a stop motion add-on and a few other things where you can get unrigged animation that you can do sort of straight ahead and
Mhm.
really get a kind of clay look or
Oh, okay.
uh, high exaggeration. Also, Blender's grease pencil tool lets you do 2D and 3 lets you do
Right,
2D
yeah.
draw in 3D space, which is totally awesome. Uh, but the level of flexibility you have to change, I'll say to change your mind or make decisions on the fly, production wise, in 2D, you don't have as much in 3D. I guess, and that's a double edged sword though, right? Because if you're able to make a lot of like, I'll say drastic, quick change decisions on the 2D thing, on your 2D animation, and you discover that that decision was the wrong one or not, maybe not the best one for communicating whatever you have to,
Sure.
you got a lot more work to redo. Whereas in the 3D side of things, you actually have uh, you've done all this lead up work. You have the ability to nuance and make changes to subtle changes to the animation
Mhm.
down farther in the pipeline, and they're not as expensive because you have all of this infrastructure. But if you want to do big changes, character arm suddenly has to stretch and wrap around a pole or something. That's a whole new build, right? That's a whole new ask for somebody who's going to be a rigger or something to
Sure.
to do that. Or you got to find a clever way to trick shot that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think I've always kind of when in the early 2000s I was all about 3D, and then I kind of went back to 2D, and I think it's because and it's probably just because my inability to get what I want out of 3D in a way that I can make like there's a way to do it. I'm just not good enough to do it, and it was just easier for me to do it in 2D, I think, whereas what I wanted to do. But yeah, I hear what you're saying.
I vastly prefer the 2D aesthetic at the very least. Um,
Yeah, I'm just talking about production, not even like
yeah,
aesthetic
yeah,
choices, but yeah. Um, but so someone who works a lot in Blender, when we talk a little bit about this software, because I think it's kind of unique in that it's an open source, it's free. You can manipulate it if you know where to go, or if you're come from that sort of computer science kind of area. So can you talk a little bit about your use of Blender as a tool
yeah.
in your creation process? Because I think that's kind of a little bit more unique, where it's like other I know some of the people I've talked to do it by hand, and some of them use Toon Boom or whatever they do. But like I think Blender's kind of a unique tool in that you can technically rebuild it if you really wanted to, if you were so inclined. It would take time, but you could. But so how has that been like as an animator and someone who comes from more of an engineering side? How does that kind of affect your work or how you think about your projects and things like that?
Yeah, so I mean, I refer to Blender as a Swiss Army chainsaw for computer graphics. You can pretty much do anything with it, and because it's open source, you you can do anything with it. If you have a little bit of technical knowledge, or you know somebody with a lot of technical knowledge that you can cajole, bribe, or pay to
Sure.
to do those sort of things. In fact, when I started my studio, I built it on an entirely open source pipeline
Mm,
because I wanted that level of flexibility. One of the things, especially, it's a little bit less now, but especially when I was starting out, one, general software was very expensive, and two,
sure.
the larger
Still very
studios
expensive. I
actually,
think
it still
Blender is
is.
Maya, I think is 5,000. I want to say like it's on a subscription service. I
It's on
don't,
a subscription, yeah.
but it's
But I mean,
not cheap by any regard.
no, no. But so one of the things I especially when I was starting out, a lot of the larger studios weren't using software off the shelf.
Right,
They had written a lot of their own in-house tools.
right,
Me being just me and whoever I could work with freelance wise, I didn't have that level of flexibility. I couldn't do that. But with Blender, if I wanted to make a change, I could, and I only
sure,
had to change that one part. So I got some of the flexibility of having written software in-house without having to write all of it in-house. I only had to make
right, right.
modifications and changes to it. And you find out that I think at least half of the core Blender development team actually started as artists that
Sure, sure.
Blender didn't do what they needed to do, so they learned how to
Okay.
code, made the
Yeah,
change, and all of a sudden they're software developer. Uh, uh, and but yeah, that means you can do a lot of, and it gets used in all sorts of crazy ways. And but there's a wide spectrum of things that it can do, and it's not necessarily the best at any one of them,
sure,
but it's very good at a lot of them, and more than sufficient for a lot of production tests, especially if you're a smaller shop. And
sure.
so, um, I'm not sure I entirely answered your question. I
No,
think I did.
I think so. I mean, I think you touched on something that a lot of students don't know, which is like a lot of times, granted, this was like 20 years ago and maybe it's different now, but like places like Pixar were like, we need to make a movie about the ocean. How do we make the ocean? And then, they would just, whether they found an algorithm and programmed it with Python or whatever, they're like, now we have an ocean thing. I
Yeah,
remember Maya in 2004 came with like an ocean. And I think it's probably because they got it
right.
from some studio that was probably doing a movie about ocean. And that's just kind of it. It's like, okay, we need something that does this. How can we do that? And maybe it's drawing it or modeling it, or maybe it's programming it, and or coming up with a tool that can make the process easier. Um,
Well, and that's actually
maybe,
what so the Pixar shorts that they do,
right.
those are technical challenges that they're solving for
Yeah,
whatever
yeah,
the next long
exactly.
form film is. And actually the Blender Foundation, Blender Studio does the same thing.
Oh,
They have
do they?
actually, yeah, they have artists on staff that they use for and they have a what they call open movie projects. If you
Mhm.
It's on Blender, it's a studio.blender.org. You can actually not only see the movies themselves are released free under Creative Commons license,
Sure,
but all of the assets that go into producing those films, the models, the actual file structure for how they link the assets together, because that's an important thing that I actually didn't step into, is how you collaborate with other people and make those files work together.
sure.
But all of that is, especially when I started, that didn't exist as a
Right,
as a
yeah.
thing. And so I'm trying to build if you're trying to build out your own pipeline, you have no examples because they're all
Right,
inside
right.
someone else's
'Cause
studio.
it's
You have to have
all
had experience with it.
proprietary. Yeah,
Whereas with the open movies that they started doing almost near the start, you see how they're working through these pipeline problems. You see how they're working through, how do you
right.
collaborate with other people? How do I work on this model over here without like destroying
Affecting.
what's being worked
Yeah.
on over here, and those sort of things. And those
That is
that
a
that
great
sort of
resource for people to learn if they're not familiar with that kind of stuff.
yeah, it's really really valuable for that sort of thing. And so yeah, I mean, so do it. Actually, I just want to back up a second. Do you think everybody sort of understands what exactly open source is, or does that need a bit of a
I at this point I'm sure I mentioned it, but I didn't in class, but I didn't dwell on it. Let's just
okay?
say. But maybe you can give like a really quick,
Yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, I
definition of it.
mean, the long and short of it, open source software consists of two parts, right? You have software that is typically free, as in cost. You don't have to pay
Right.
for it. You can download it. Blender, you can get from blender.org for free. But it's also, they call it free as in speech, meaning
Right.
that not only do you have that application, but you also have all the source code to it. So if you want it to do something that it doesn't currently do, or you want to take out stuff that it does that is not important to you, you have the ability to do it on your own, or hire someone to do it for you.
Fine.
And that level of flexibility you really don't get with
Yeah,
any other type
no. I
of
mean,
software.
Blender, as far as I know, is the only 3D program that does that.
Yeah.
There might be some I'm not aware of it, but yeah, no,
I
I
mean, so to
sorry.
a degree, Unreal kind of does. It's not open source, but you can get the source to the game engine if you don't make any
Okay.
money. Uh,
Is
but the
Unity
licensing
still
on it
open
gets tricky.
source? I haven't kept up. Unity went
Is
all
it?
crazy last year. And
No,
now it's like,
Unity is not open source. They
okay,
do sort of follow a similar model in that you can modify. I think you can modify Unity source code, but the same sort of thing. It's not one of the traditional
not
open
better.
source licenses. You don't have
Got it.
the right to modify and redistribute as you see fit.
Got it. Okay. I think another aspect, I've kind of dabbled a little bit in the open source. For a little while, I was trying to help out Inkscape actually with more on the user interface as opposed to writing code or anything necessarily. But one aspect I always kind of like about it is to a certain degree, it kind of levels the playing field. Where I've always, especially as someone who teaches a lot in community colleges, I always feel like it's like, you know, great, I have this idea, but now I got to go to an expensive school because they have the software, or I got to spend $5,000 a year on Maya, and who's got that kind of money, right? So it's like there's these barriers just to do what you want, and then you open source software in the graphics area, whether it's GIMP, Inkscape, Blender, in my opinion, is by far the most sophisticated one. Um, Really cuts that down. I mean, and that's something I really, really like. Open tunes I use sometimes too, or Tahoma 2D, which is a variation of it. Um, in that, people can just try it out. You don't got to spend a whole bunch of money just to try it out. And if you like it, hey, great. You can keep doing stuff. You can make your own stuff if you'd like, if you feel like it accomplishes what you need to accomplish. Or you can go to Maya if you feel like Maya has some killer feature that you really need, that kind of thing. But it levels the playing field in a world where economically that's not always easy to do, and that's always an aspect I've always appreciated about open source kind of stuff like that. And I
Absolutely.
think
Well,
that's very
and
valuable for students and people in general.
absolutely, and I think the interoperability is another big part of that, and not being locked in, right? So
Right,
you're talking about dealing with Adobe or Autodesk, and you don't pay your subscription. Well, those files are only opened by those applications. You can't
right,
open
right.
those files in another application. That said, I will say that Adobe has sort of turned a bit of a corner. I think last year's SIGGRAPH they mentioned that the USD file format is like a
Mhm.
first class citizen on Adobe Cloud. So you
Okay.
can so they're that USD, for anybody who doesn't know, is an open source file format that was actually originally developed in Pixar and is being used more and more for interchange and
Is this
production
a
work
3D
in 3D.
format
It's a
or
3D format.
okay, kind of like
It
a
does
PJ
support
file kind of?
more more than that, but yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
I've been out of
so
3D for a while, so I don't know what's cool now.
no, it's fine, but
But
it's also it incorporates general graphics data too. Not many people are using it as much for that, but that's why Adobe's starting to play with it more as well. As you can use USD for a bunch of other things because it's in the name. It's a universal
got it.
scene descriptor.
Got it. Got it. Ooh. So if my students were, do you have any advice for people starting off in 3D, maybe in a Blender type environment, who want to get better at animating or doing their own work? Do you have any kind of advice for them or?
My recommendation is always um, come up with a project and then figure out how to produce it.
Hmm.
You'll find out very quickly whether or not it's over ambitious,
Right.
and or under ambitious, and you'll finish it in a
Right.
half day, and you're like, oh, that was easy. Let me try what the next thing is.
Right.
More often than not, it's like I want to do something really epic, and all of a sudden you're like, oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a lot bigger. So even in those
Yes, for
situations, you take
sure.
the big problem and break it down into smaller productions that solve sort of help you figure out the bits and pieces that you need to do. I recommend lots of small projects rather than trying to learn everything in one giant project. There's a fun study about and I'm not sure if you've heard of this one, but it's actually in sculpting
Okay.
where they had a class and they split the class into two, and they told half the class that they have the entire semester to make one sculpture, the
Hmm.
best possible sculpture that they could make. And
Okay.
then they told the other class, make as many sculptures as your
Right, right,
option, what your choice is to do is to you have to do volume. You just have to make a
right,
lot.
right. Make as many as you can.
By the end of that semester, the second group was producing stronger work, and their finished pieces were better than those of the first group.
I can see
um,
that
because they learned more, they
by
tried more
doing.
different things. They didn't get themselves painted in the corner on one thing and have to sort of
Right.
noodle on that. It's really about finding a lot of small problems and solving them, screwing up an awful lot, and then sort of internalizing what you've learned from one, and then taking that and making new mistakes on the next one.
I'm a big believer in you learn by doing.
Mhm.
And so for me as a teacher, I give a lot of very small, in my opinion, small labs, like, do this, do this, do this. And then you do that and you do like, I give a lot of labs. Like if you looked at
Right,
how many I give in a semester, I arguably maybe depending on the class give like 20, 30 labs, which is a
right,
lot, but they're small. Like they're things that can be done in half an hour. And then I'm hoping by the time they get to a bigger project, it's like, great, you've done all that. Now you can, and kind of hopefully it's kind of like what you were saying, where the people who are doing as many sculptures as they can, they got all their problems out first, and now they have a stronger idea of what they need to do.
right. I'll also say this is specific to Blender in general. Among, I would say, almost any creative software, that there are more Blender tutorials online than anywhere than any other application, probably
Oh, really?
combined.
That I didn't know.
There's a mountain of them. The place that I do most of my dayside work for is associated with CG Cookie, with it, which is
Mhm.
an
Yeah, yeah,
education
I know
platform
CG
for Blender.
Cookie.
And that's where I spend most of my day. That the parent company is for what I do on the consulting side is also the parent company for CG Cookie.
Oh, okay.
Um, but when you look for tutorials, when you do even when you're not looking, when you're doing tutorials, they look for the ones that don't just tell you which button to push, but
Right.
tell you why you're pushing it.
Exactly.
And even if you find ones that tell you push this button to get, I want to make this particular thing, push this button, and I got this particular thing, monkey around with the settings, change them
Right.
from what they tell you on purpose so that you can actually learn what the button does.
Understand
Because a
what
lot
does
of
what.
Exactly, because a lot of tutorial makers, they get their clicks by making something sexy and showing you
Yeah,
how to
yeah.
make that one thing sexy.
Right.
They don't necessarily teach you how to use Blender, so you have to sort of.
It's a recipe and not a
Right,
tutorial. Yeah, I
right.
run into this a lot where it's like I have what I call in-class labs or exercises where it's like
Mhm.
most basic thing. It's not sexy at all, but the point is not to make something look cool. It's to just teach whatever the skill that I'm trying to get across is. So it's like,
Right,
here, make this, pull its vertices. Does it look cool? Does it look like a realistic donut? No, but it's simple. So the more simple I can make it, the more you're going to focus on the skill and not like
exactly.
having everything look like a big, sexy, shiny thing that you can put up there. So yeah, I
Right.
totally agree with you on that. Um, if students were interested in learning more or participating in the Blender community, do you have any suggestions or links they might want to look at or anything like that?
Yeah, I would say the largest and longest running Blender community, online Blender community, is at blenderartist.org.
Okay.
I'm a moderator on there,
Okay.
but like they're you can go there for help. You can show off your artwork. You
Mhm.
can there's a whole bunch of stuff that there's even a small job board there for that sort of thing. That's
Perfect.
sort of a really good place to get sort of talking to the community, see what's going on with Blender development and those sort of things. I will give a small plug. I also wrote Blender for Dummies, and
Oh yeah, yeah. I'll make a
the
link to that
latest
in the
the
video.
latest edition of that comes out on April 30th. So
And you can
from
get that
this,
from Amazon or anything
yeah, you
or
can get it on Amazon, get it wherever. So
um,
it's the latest one is 750 pages worth of
oh
stuff on
wow.
Blender. So yes, it's a Blender all-in-one for Dummies. So
Great.
there's that's I think that's a decent resource. I'm a little biased,
If you
but
do say so yourself.
yes, yes.
Well, great. Well, I think the students, got a lot out of this and learned a little bit about the process. Most of our artists or people have been 2D animators, so it's good to always kind of like compare and contrast the different types of work and the different areas that animation can go in. So We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a great one.